Well, ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I want to talk to you about one very simple aspect and the most fundamental gel in all human relationships, and certainly something upon which my job as a conductor depends, and that is trust. There has to be between me and an orchestra an absolutely unshakable bond of trust, through which and within which we can spin a musical narrative that we all believe in. Now, it may surprise you to know that conducting hasn't always been about trust. I'm talking about the 19th century, certainly the early years of the 20th century, when the world was more populated than it is now by dictator figures and that kind of model. Conducting was less about trust and more about coercion. A conductor would rigorously rehearse, not the orchestra as a whole simply, but each individual within it, within an inch of their lives. Where to breathe, how to colour something, how to phrase something. Very little room for personal freedom. Well, I'm happy to say that the world's moved on largely from the dictator model. Music's moved on with it. Conducting is now much more about a two-way street, a shared vision. I, as the conductor, have to come to the rehearsal with a cast-iron sense of the outer architecture of a piece of music, within which there is then enormous personal freedom for each and every member of that orchestra to shine. So it works pretty well, provided there is trust in the room. But of course, long before I can trust the orchestra or they me, I have first to trust myself. Very obvious, almost facetious point to make, but nonetheless, each and every one of us knows all about this. And in the early years of my career, a bit wet behind the ears, I had that thing of constantly sort of overcompensating in the way that we probably all do. You're trying to persuade somebody of something. So what do? You kind of overdo it. It's almost like you start telling white lies. And in my game, that means over-gesticulation. The more and more I kind of flailed around like a rabid windmill in order to try and persuade an orchestra just to get a little bit louder. Of course, they wouldn't do it. They sort of went the other way. There's no trust in the room anymore. More, I was a figure of fun. And I remember a particularly wicked or mischievous member of one orchestra in those early days sharing a little joke with me. He said, "Charles, what do you think is the difference between a bull and an orchestra?" I said, "I don't know, what is the difference between a bull and an orchestra?" He said, "Well, with a bull, the horns are at the front and the arseholes at the back." You can imagine this joke turned my guts to water, and how futile seemed the cogent words of advice I'd received from a great veteran British conductor, Sir Colin Davis, who said, "Conducting is like holding a small bird in your hand. Hold it too tightly, you crush it. Hold it too loosely, and it flies away." Well, in those early years, I couldn't even find the bird. Anyhow, time's moved on. I want to tell you now a little bit about a country that I've had huge privilege and pleasure to work with extensively over the last decade or so, South Africa, a country and a culture which has taught me an immeasurable amount about the power of music to build trust where before there was none. So back in 2000, I got the opportunity to go to South Africa, which is the most dizzyingly musical country on the planet, by the way, in order to put together a crack squad opera company, a new initiative, a platform for some of the astonishing vocal jewels which lie in their millions in that country. I mean, in the Xhosa culture alone, there are probably 300 songs for doing the washing up. Can you imagine how many there are for a circumcision ritual or a wedding or a funeral? Everything is chronicled and expressed in song. So anyway, I went out there and I auditioned over a 3-month period right across the country, mainly in very rural township locations. Heard about 2,000 singers in that period and put at the end of it together a company of 40 of the most jaw-droppingly talented young singer-performers. Now, the way it fell out, perhaps not surprisingly, about 37, well, exactly 37 of those 40 were black and 3 were white. In the very first week of rehearsal, something monstrous emerged. One of the black members recognized one of the white singers because in his previous career, this guy had been a member of the South African police force, and in the very last years of apartheid, he would routinely be detailed to go into townships to aggress the community. You can only imagine what that did to the temperature in the rehearsal room, a kind of like a huge chasm, a fissure, a vast gulf opened up. And we were despondent. Like, how are we going to turn this around? How are we going to make any coherent work? How are we going to build some trust here where there palpably is none? Let's make no mistake. There is no relationship more devoid of trust in South Africa than that between a white policeman and the black community. Well, ladies and gentlemen, singing was what did it. We just sang and sang and sang, and miraculously, fresh bridges of trust started to grow. Compassion, tolerance, understanding, a real sense of tight-knittedness. And this company ended up being the most intensely close-knit bond of people I've ever had the great privilege to work with. We developed a few shows, one of which was a new version of Carmen, which we toured internationally. It played in the West End here, played in New York, etc., etc. These guys became very well-travelled, and despite their very humble origins, they ended up within about 3 years in the top 25% of wage earners in South Africa, something I'm particularly proud of. Anyway, Carmen, we then decided we'd make a movie of, and we shot it on location in a huge township outside Cape Town called Khayelitsha. I just want to show you just a little burst of it now, just to remind you, in case you need a reminding, or just to share with you that there is something so fantastically visceral about South African music making. Thank you. I want to spend a minute now just celebrating that amazing thing which happened here in London last summer, the Paralympic Games in particular. What an amazing initiative, and didn't it feel fabulous, it coming home? Because it was home, wasn't it? It was a British idea back in the late 40s. But let's not forget that it's taken over 50 years for the world to enter into a position of trust as regards Paralympian sport, to see beyond the idea which people naturally fall back on, that perhaps because disabled people are involved in it, it's about a therapy, it's about a very nice, warm, fuzzy feeling. Didn't they do well? They took part, they had a great experience. Of course, what we now understand is that Paralympian sport is about the very highest levels of sporting achievement, and the disability, as such, is irrelevant. Now, I got 4 kids, and my youngest kid was born with cerebral palsy just over 6 years ago. So you can imagine, she, aside from just being a gorgeous little human being, has given me an introduction to a whole community of people which I'd never considered or thought about before. In other words, the disabled community. And I found myself thinking about the Paralympics and thinking what an incredible model and initiative it has been. And yet, music is even more universal than sport, isn't it? It's actually the most universal language we have as a species, way beyond any dialect or tongue. So why is it, in the course of a 20-year career conducting orchestras around the world, that I can think of only 3 musicians with disability that I've encountered in the whole of that 20-year career? Now, that's not because there's any sign on the door of any orchestra which says disabled people are not welcome here. It's because the world hasn't done the joined-up thinking. The world has not used its imagination on this issue. So, this is about 18 months ago. I found myself thinking, right, well, the Paralympics are coming to London. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The eyes of the world on our community. Time to do what I can to make a substantial difference. So thus began the idea of forming a group, which we decided in the end to call the British Paraorchestra. The reason why we wanted to call it the British Paraorchestra, because we wanted to stop at nothing to have them very brightly featured in one of the ceremonies around the Paralympic Games, in a way to throw down a gauntlet to the world, to say, okay, here's our first Paraorchestra, Russia, China, Japan, Poland, where are yours? So I campaigned at number 10. I campaigned at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I campaigned at LOCOG, which is the organising committee of the Games. I campaigned at the Paralympics closing and opening ceremony committees. I campaigned at the British Paralympic Association. I became like some kind of crazed zealot because I was staking my reputation, and in so doing saying to people, look, I have a career, I have heft, I have momentum. I make great music. I've survived in a cutthroat industry for 20 years and I continue to survive. Are you telling me that you don't trust me to put something together which is going to have absolute intrinsic musical value? So all this kind of hectoring and carrying on and tub thumping did in the end cause a sea change in opinion, and in the end it came actually from Coldplay, to whom I shall be everlastingly thankful that they embraced the orchestra. They of course were the main event at the closing ceremony of the Paralympic Games, and they said, we must have the Paraorchestra playing with us. And so, of course, with their might behind our project, everything suddenly changed. I want to show you a very short film, just to introduce some of the amazing characters in this group. If you've had to circumvent massive challenges in your life, the like of which the rest of us can't even begin to imagine, then really you don't give a damn how you look, how you come across. You know, you're way evolved beyond all that stuff. You trust yourself and you trust everyone else. So in that respect, the disabled artist community has everything to teach the rest of us. Thank you very much.